Hello, everyone. Good to see all of you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with all of you, and I'm happy to be here. I'll just do some introductions. We have just to my left here is Casey Bailey. She's the head of people at Deel. Kelly Devine is actually the divisional president of UK and Ireland for MasterCard. And then Joan is right here. Joan McGrail. She is the Chief Human Resources Officer at New Balance. So there's all of their bios. We're not going to spend too much time talking about who's on the panel here. We're going to dig right in. So in my role, I've realized as writing the book on burnout that there has been some pretty significant changes over the last several years. And what's happened is that there has been more conversation around, benefits, mental health, mental illness, all the things that came out of the pandemic that have been there all along. And so I know that, these folks up here have spent quite a bit of time, in this space, but there's been some really exciting, transformational things out of something that was really challenging. And so I want to kind of start with this idea that even though we've had these concepts and benefits in place for a while, it is a new era of well-being. So what steps do we need to take to ensure that we're reaching this ever increasingly and rapidly changing diverse workforce, especially generationally? We talked about the 5 generations kind of under one tent. So how are we actually making sure that we're taking those steps to make our well-being benefits inclusive and not exclusive?
I'm happy to start. Sure. I'm assuming my mic is okay. So at Deel, we have people sitting in 97 countries as of today. So we're about 2,600 people across those countries. So we're naturally very diverse, but also everything that we do begins with the worker type, contractor or employee, and the country that they sit in. Because until we understand those elements about an individual, whether it's from hiring, managing them across the team member experience, or them departing the organization, we have to know what we need to offer from a statutory minimum requirement aspect, but then what do we want to go above and beyond to offer. But because of that cultural diversity, we think about it in terms of how do we acknowledge what the needs of people are, how do we understand what inclusivity looks like in the offerings that we're bringing or different programs across our HR space, and then what is the visibility of that programming, right? How can people access it? How can they give us feedback? How can they ask for different things, clarify understanding, have the self-service aspect to it? And certainly we are only 4 years old as a company, so we are still building much of this. But if we continue to think about those things, then that enables us to bring forward the flexibility, because we've taken the stance that rather than trying to label certain benefits or programs, we attempt to give more flexibility, whether it's a cash program that people can access on a monthly basis to spend on what they need, or whether it's programming that we're giving to them that are through different partners or vendors.
Can I just do a follow-up? You mentioned that you're doing sort of this listening and actioning those what you hear. Can you explain a little bit around that, kind of tactically, how you pull that information and then how you actually generate kind of concepts and programs around that?
Sure. So we are an HR technology company. So we are our own HR tech stack. So we do leverage.
You want to use your own product.
We want to use our own product, but we do leverage some of that technology. So one of our Engage products by Deel, for example, allows us to send surveys. So we sent our first survey last November to get information. And since it was our first survey, as you can imagine, lots of information coming in on engagement, programming. And then we also just get a lot of information via Slack, honestly. So I don't know how many hundreds of different Slack channels and Slack groups that we have. But throughout those groups, all communications at Deel happen via Slack. There's a lot of anecdotal information that comes, whether someone is specifically making a request or providing feedback, which they do, and certainly in our Ask People channels they do, but also in other channels, travel or a specific country, or as we were just sharing before, London is our highest utilization of WeWork access, us being a fully remote company across any of our countries that we operate in. And we learn those things by accessing the Slack channels and understanding the dialogue that's happening there. But we are listening, and we are taking that information back, and we're constantly looking at our programming because we're constantly adding new countries as people start. We added 3 new countries today, for example, with people who were accepted, not started. So it's a constant evolving of what do we want to offer, how do we bring it to life programmatically, and then how do we get the feedback around it.
I love that. That's very tactical. Do you want to also, Kelly, answer that first question? I'd love to hear from all of the panelists on that one.
Yeah. I was just going to add that I think there's something in understanding in detail the value that benefits bring to your company. So it helps you to attract good talent in the first place. It helps you to retain talent. It helps your talent to be productive and happy. And therefore, when you're thinking about that commercial balance between how much money you're going to invest in this, to understand what return that might bring is not a super easy thing to do. So my hat's off to anyone in the audience who spends their time doing that. But I think that how you understand the value of the benefits is a really important part of it, so that you don't underinvest. And then I think the second piece is what you do with the information you get. So we did a survey recently where we asked people to react to various different benefits that they're offered, and to sort of do a trade-off exercise. You know, would you prefer this or this, or this or this? And it's sort of gone into a bit of a black box now as we try and work out what to do with all of that information. And I think that leaves people thinking, oh, I answered those questions. What are you doing with it? So I think that communication piece, the engagement, making that an ongoing conversation, is also a really important piece of the puzzle.
How do you help people actually understand the value? You know, how do you make them feel bought in?
Do you mean the
Employees, or are you thinking of the people with the finance pen?
The people that are investing, yes, in it.
The guys with
I guess
finance
both,
pen.
but let's start with that one first.
I think it's a mix of reasons. We've got relatively big company, 30,000 odd people across hundreds of markets globally. So you can be relatively evidence-based even within our own walls about what difference it makes. So it's quite easy to track ourselves what engagement we get with people from different benefits, and you can kind of see what that's driving. You can see the link between usage of benefits and, you know, retention at the company. So there's data that sits within your own walls, and then of course there's data that sits outside as well. And I think, you know, working with people who can help you tap into that is incredibly helpful. But it has to be led, I think it has to be in partnership with the business. I think where I've seen it be less successful is where you have a benefits team that sits in one part of the business, doing all of that analysis really robustly, really well thought out strategy, and then fighting the fight on their own without having tapped into the business who are able to articulate how it helps their people to be more productive. So I think how you join it up to make it a whole talent retention, people engagement, productivity strategy versus a benefit strategy.
I just have one thing to add on that. Yeah. We have I listened to the value session too before this. We have a value called conservative frugality. We are a startup. We are still a private company, and you know, we take it very seriously about how we're spending our resources, but we try to not just assume that people understand the financial aspect, right, of the decisions that we're making. We try to connect the dots around how are we investing, why are we investing, what have you said, what have we done, what are we continuing to add or modify as we go. And again, we're just in our infancy of that, but I think it does tie back to the values perspective of what do you value, how are you bringing that to life for the different people, and how they understand the choices that you make or don't make, or decisions made or not made.
I love that, because lack of justice and fairness and lack of autonomy and agency, 2 root causes of burnout. So the more that you are, you know, enabling conversations and having transparency is a big improvement on well-being. So that's excellent. Do we have Joan? Is she? Oh, it's still not working? Okay. Well, I'm going to go on to the second question. How should employers react to the social, political, environmental influences that we've all been seeing sort of increase? I know that it's always been there, and it could be our media diet has changed, but they're definitely ever present. And so how are we kind of keeping up with those changing needs? I think, you know, environmental, there's situations in various, you know, countries globally that we're working with. There's so many things that are happening that we have to adjust on the fly. So, you know, we'll start with you, Kelly, around what you're ways of tackling that are? It's a big question.
I think you do have to tackle them is the first thing to say, and by that I don't mean react to them,
Right.
but you do have to acknowledge that they're there, because people live in their communities, in their environment. People work in a particular context, and you have to acknowledge when that context changes. And we were talking about it as we came in, but COVID being the obvious example, it changes it changed people's lives often. People made life decisions about where they would live and how they would work and how they would take care of their kids, or where their parents would be, what kind of job they might want to do. So you have to pay attention to these social forces, I think, and you have to work out how to adapt benefits, and that's benefits in the broadest sense. That's not healthcare, that's your expectations of your people, what flexibility you give them, what empowerment you give them. So that's thinking about benefits in its broadest sense. But I think the other piece of that is, and it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on this, Casey, but working for a big company, that's somewhat easy to do because you get help to do it. There's loads of experts who can spend their time analysing that context and can help you figure out, what does that mean for our employees? What does that mean for our customers? How do we need to react? When politicians table a potential new idea, we can pay attention to that and spend some time figuring out what that might mean for our business and get ourselves ready. If you're a small business or a scaling business, it's not necessarily possible to do that. So I think we have to think about how to help. I'm thinking particularly of very small businesses here, maybe rather than where you're at, but how we help smaller businesses be able to offer that same care for their employees as maybe it's easier for bigger businesses to do.
Yeah,
not to say they always do it.
You're right, and I want you to answer this, but I think culture really does start in that kind of very seedling stage, and so if we don't have access to people that can give us the right sort of guidance and mentorship, then it can go off the rails. And so I'd love to hear in your experience how you're dealing with these kinds of concepts.
Yeah, I mean, it very much is our business. So our business is, we provide an HR and payroll service, right, to hire, manage, pay your global workforce. And so we are always watching out for those small to medium-sized businesses, because we, again, we're not a huge company, but being as large as we are, and it being our business to have the knowledge and to create the knowledge base and to offer the services. So for example, with the Ukraine and Russia war, right, impacts to financial technology and payments immediately that we needed to solve, not just for ourselves internally from an HR perspective, but also externally for our customers across the platform. Same thing with Turkey and Syria and the recent earthquakes. Same thing, what do we do? What's on the ground? What services? People need internet. How are we handling that? How can we serve up best practices or give resources for our customers to handle that? So we're constantly reacting, probably, to just what is happening and monitoring it, because we might sit in 97 countries, but we've got people around the world sitting in our customers in over 100 countries. So that awareness and understanding, what can we do? How can we then turn that immediately around to the customer, so that the people who wouldn't otherwise have access or maybe know what to do or have that skill set on their team can leverage what we are doing.
And then that frame of reference obviously then helps to guide you in policy and how you're going to handle the next one. We have Joan back, which I'm so happy to see you. I don't know if you want to jump into this question or if you want to go back to the well-being question that I asked in the first place, but maybe we should talk to you, because you and I had that conversation before around the social, political, environmental piece and how it influences the way that you're responding to changing needs.
Yes, I would say, generally speaking, what we've really come to understand is that our associates have very different needs. And so rather than make assumptions about what those needs are and what solutions we should be applying, we've been very intentional in creating opportunity for safe space and a climate and a culture that enrolls individuals and gives them a place to really talk about what they're experiencing, not only at work, but in their life, right? Knowing these things are very much integrated. And what solutions are they recommending? What are they in need of? And that really has helped us. We've done that by way of associate resource groups, other forums with our CEO, really focused on mental health and on leading a number of those discussions. We have other forums that we call 1NB forums, where we bring associates together and really just making sure that no subject is off limits and all is intended to support our understanding about associate experience and therefore to come together on what solutions we offer.
I love that. No subject off limits. That's a really difficult kind of mindset to have in an organization. And I think that we're learning how to navigate those difficult conversations better, but it's really difficult. I want to I think that ties into this question around, benefits and programs being geared to specific groups, and we talked about this kind of lumping in if we make specific supports, which are much needed, for groups, but maybe they'll feel like that's actually creating an exclusionary language or narratives. So, how can we kind of weave, that issue and ensure that the benefits are inclusive and global? One of the things I thought about, just an example is parental leaves, and we talked about this earlier in one of the talks, but when you have one country that has 4 weeks off, you have another country that is a year off, and understanding how to navigate across your global firm to have equity, there's just a lot of juggling. So, I'll start right here with you, Casey, and I'd love to hear from everyone around, the answer to that.
Sure.
The silver bullet solution.
Sure.
Thank you.
Well, our workforce globally is made up of both contractors and full-time employees. And so that right there, like I said, everything starts with worker type and country into what we're going to offer. But above and beyond that, we've looked at a lot of data. Again, it is our business to create this knowledge base for customers to look across the data set and say, what is going to be our ideal global policy? And what we go out and say on things like parental leave or vacation, sick, personal, and all the ways that that could vary across all of these different countries for people is to say we're going to set our global standards as our minimum or maximums of those benefits, and looking country to country or worker type by worker type, then if we have something greater, then you are guaranteed to get that greater benefit. Or if your country and your worker type gives you something greater, then we will manage to that, absolutely. And again, it makes the manager job, never mind the HR job or the administrative job, it makes the job of the manager, I think, one of the most complex manager jobs that they might ever have. Because a manager at Deal could be managing across 14, 15, 20, 50 different countries, depending upon the size of the team and their organization. And just getting a simple question, can I take this week off? Okay, what week is it? What is it for? What does it mean? Where do you sit? What's happening? And so creating a knowledge base that people can access, but also support across our HR function, that they can get that information to be able to make the right decisions legally and compliantly, but also for the benefit of those individuals. So really trying to think about how do we, again, harness the ability to be flexible while also setting some standards, but managing a wildly complex environment.
It does sound complex, which is, which is great. I mean, being able to do it, I think, is a feat in its own. Joan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well.
This has been a really interesting mindset shift for us at New Balance, in that historically we have really thought about benefits and perks as being the same, and anywhere that we could possibly offer the same, absent different laws and whatnot, we would. And we translated that to that being fair. And we've almost really had an epiphany in recent years about what's fair and what's needed is what our associates need at different life stages and career stages and whatnot. And so how do we really come to understand different needs and solve for that in a way that ensures every group and population is getting the same level of attention, even if the benefits are not the same? So if I'll give just one example, Jen, if you don't mind, we're also really looking at data and trying to understand what does our data additionally inform. So one example that I'll use for you is we have 17% of our workforce are women between the ages of 40 and 60. And we were coming up really short in offering any type of menopause benefit, support, resourcing. So really pouring in there as one example of that isn't needed by everybody. It is needed by this really important population, and we've looked to differentiate in that way.
Can you share just what you came up with? I mean, what sort of tactics specifically or strategies that you implemented to read that data and action it?
Yes, so in addition to the data, really in a number of the forums that we've talked about, just creating space for conversations about associated struggle and life stage and whatnot. And so what we've done is partnered with a vendor who really has expertise and resourcing and bundled that under what historically had only really been a fertility and family planning offering, right? And so this just takes us to the next life stage with some very robust offerings.
Yeah, we've been hearing a lot more around menopause benefits and some of these other pieces, and I think it's important that we address that is something that women, go through, and if we don't address that and have conversations about it, then it goes ignored and underrepresented. So I'd love to hear you, Kelly, too, on this sort of piece around threading that needle.
Yeah, I was going to pick up specifically on, so having done the sort of breadth of multi-market, then thinking about how you talk about a particular benefit in one market, given you have a diverse audience. So thinking about something like the menopause, for example, there's a risk that when you have something like this, which is relatively new in terms of talking about it, at least at work, you're trying to talk about it, you're trying to maybe articulate what your benefits are, and there's a risk that in doing that, and in trying to simplify it, to take it to a large audience, that you make it sound as though everyone's experience of the menopause is the same and everyone will need exactly the same benefit. So I think I try to think about doing it across multiple markets, but even when you're trying to do it within one, how you try and address these issues and talk about these issues in a way that doesn't put every woman of a certain age and have everyone just think, oh, okay, this must be their need. Is a really interesting challenge. And again, I think it comes back to that communication engagement piece versus just, did you negotiate exactly the right benefit and put it in the policy somewhere?
I also think culturally sensitive, right? I mean, we have individuals who don't want to celebrate their birthday on the Slack channel or want to see representation or recognition in a different way. There are just a multitude, right, of topics that you have to cover and understand what is appropriate, how to opt in, how to opt out. And so I think, again, we've opted for flexibility in what we're doing, and our average age isn't there yet. So we haven't heard enough chatter around the menopause topic yet, with our average age being in the 30s. But it's something interesting, I think, to think about. How do you talk about and communicate it then without ostracizing one group, but also including the group who's interested?
I would love to know, Kelly, have you tested out any ways that have worked? Do you have examples of how you're actually doing this tactically within your organization?
So if I can actually borrow an example from a bank who told me about what they were doing, so I'm going to have a shout out to Lloyds on this one. They did a session where they were doing an education session for the benefits of their employees, but they did it in the evening so that employees could invite family members who might be affected or partners who might want to learn more about it as well. And I thought that was really interesting because it stopped it being a conversation about a very specific group of people who work within Lloyds, and actually all of a sudden it turned it into a conversation that was relevant for everybody. And I think even in the workplace it is, because it might be you, it might be someone you lead, it might be your leader, it might be a customer. So I think sometimes when you're broaching these sensitive topics, trying to find a way into them that has that broader relevance so that everyone feels like they have a stake in it and it isn't just a niche topic. I think the concept of allyship is a really interesting one and something we spend a lot of time talking about. But I think all of those things are really important when you're treading into these areas where, as you say, you might want to be sort of sensitive and not assume that everyone wants to engage in the content in exactly the same way.
I love that. We're on to Slido questions, I think, now. We only have about 5 minutes left, so I'm seeing if there are any. I have more questions if not. Okay, so a challenge with employee surveys and benefits is if they ask for something regularly that the company cannot provide, how can employers communicate well in this situation? So would love to have, I'm not sure who would be best to answer that, but Joan, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. Yeah, for us, integrity is a core value. Communication and our commitment to internal communications is very strong, and we've only continued to prioritize that in recent years. And so what we have absolutely found is where we come forward early in a very transparent way, sharing details about why decisions are made and how we have found that our associates generally, while they may not always like the answer, if rounded that way, come to appreciate. I can give you one example that comes to mind in that we know that flexibility is really a standard globally now for our associates. We were really struggling with frontline associates in manufacturing in particular, wanting in on the flexibility game, if you will. And yet it's a really difficult thing to try and unpack. So what we're able to do is talk about a pilot program in our Flimby factory where we employ about 270 people who went from a 5-day work week to a compressed 4-day work week. And what we explained in our factory, the ones that perform in that pilot, make sure that there were not unintentional increase in competitive injuries and other things, and that we would come back with those learnings. And so engaging in that way has proven beneficial for us.
I love that, the testing and iterating piece of, doing well with your benefits and organizing. And we talked about this earlier, the fact that we've had this sort of narrow focus on flexibility being where we work, and understanding that there's other ways that we can create flexibility is, I think, really crucial. Would either of you like to answer that question? Do you want me to go on to the next one? Well, I'll ask you, Kelly, why don't you tell me how you can communicate better about programs that you can't necessarily take on that people want?
I think it's honesty. And I think, your employees are smart people. They'll get it. They understand that there's a trade-off, and that you have to trade off both between what you can afford, but also between a million things that you'd love to be able to do for your employees, and you just can't do all of them. And I think if you treat your employees with, respect and dignity, and say, look, we want to engage with you, but we know that sometimes we're going to hear things that we just can't do, then we're not ready yet. And maybe that means that they're on a roadmap, or maybe it means that we're just not going to get there. But I think people understand that. And I think if you're willing to be bold and brave and have those conversations, you're going to get much farther than if you hide and don't ask because you're afraid that you might hear something that you can't deal with.
I have an example. So our number one thing by far that people ask, we were born as a remote company, right? We've only acquired offices through acquisitions of companies, is to bring people together.
Yeah.
In our engagement survey, anecdotally, in Slack, in my DMs, and anywhere that we have team members here, they might ask, right? It's our number one thing is when can we all get together as a company, as a team? When can we travel? Because while they still want the flexibility, right, of living and working from anywhere, they want to gather with their team members, which is why we see here in London, WeWork usage is up more than anywhere else. But we've gone back to them, and last year we said, it's just simply not in the budget, right? Like we never forecasted for this. Yeah. So while we're doing well, this is not possible. And then this year we came back and said, we heard you, we can't go all the way there, right? But here's a playbook for how we're thinking about bringing people together. We still default remote, but here are the situations, and we're giving more power and budget to the leaders. Again, not fully the answer that they wanted around like, great, we're booked. But still providing that, showing that it's we're on the road together, and we're continue to look at it, invest in it, but being honest about that, it's not going to get all the way there, maybe right from the beginning.
I love that. That's a great example. I know that remote first companies right now are kind of dealing with how do we get people together, and you're seeing utilization of these shared offices up. So that's going to be a new conversation for maybe another panel. I've been told to wrap up, but I would love just even 60 seconds before we go, kind of that one practical piece of advice for any kind of person, leader, HR manager in the room that they can do kind of something that you're leading with on the benefits and communication piece.
Communicate more on the benefits you already have. You're probably not making most of what's already there.
That's a good one. Yes, most people don't actually leverage them as much as they need to. So yeah, communicate more. That's a good one. What would you say, Casey?
I would just say acknowledgement, right? Just continuing to hear, you're probably all in different journeys at your companies into what the life cycle of your company looks like, but just continuing to acknowledge that things are changing. Your workforce is changing. It's going to continue to change. So kind of meeting people where they are in the moment.
I love that it's a compassion and empathy directive. Joan, I'd love to hear you just wrap that up. Any tips or advice for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you from our perspective at New Balance, what we've learned in recent years is rigidity limits us. And so really creating space to stay open, curious, agile, to do a lot of testing and learning and iterating. And that has proven to be really successful overall, but certainly in the benefit space, in the total reward space.
Well, that's perfect. I will end on that note. Thank you, everyone. It was so great to have you on the panel. I felt like it went too fast. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.